Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the World City Summit 2021 session on the Science to Building Social Resilience, jointly organized by the Center for Liveable Cities and the Urban Redevelopment Authority. Today's webinar is held in partnership with the Urban Sustainability R&D e-Symposia 2021, a year-long series of webinars co-organized by 20 ministries and agencies. Through these webinars, the e-Symposia seeks to share with the community our Research and Innovation Enterprise 2025 research plans under the Urban Solutions and Sustainability domain, and to forge new partnerships to both promote interdisciplinary research and translate research outcomes for deployment. Without further ado, let me hand over the time to our session moderator, Ms. Elaine Tan, Deputy Director of Research from the Center for Liveable Cities. Elaine, please.
Thank you, Andy, and good morning, everyone. Welcome to our session on the science to building social resilience. Today, cities around the world are still facing the challenges of overcoming the COVID-19 pandemic, causing stresses and disruptions on national and urban systems across the world. The silver lining has been the unity and strength of communities to cooperate to contain the spread of the virus and to support each other. The Center for Liveable Cities is launching a new publication here at WCS. The publication documents Singapore's response to the pandemic over the past year, and what we observe is that communities possess the instincts to self-mobilize and self-help. The willingness to help one another in the community, such as making hand sanitizers with household items and placing them in public lifts, spoke well of the community spirit and trust that is prevalent. Societies with strong social infrastructure like trust and social capital will be better able to withstand, recover, and grow from stresses and shocks. In Singapore, our planning strategies and policies aim to facilitate desired outcomes for building social resilience, to promote inclusivity, social capital, civic participation, and a sense of community. For example, public spaces like social and community facilities, open plazas and parks not only provide spaces for respite, but also provide platforms for social interaction and community building to meet the needs of different demographic groups. The Singapore Together movement that was launched in 2019 sets the stage for Singaporeans to partner with the government in citizen-led initiatives to shape the city and nation together. In the spirit of this movement, CLC spearheaded the Building Community Resilience Research Program since 2019 to bring residents together to improve their neighborhood as part of a critical process of building social resilience. One of the efforts is a pilot project at Cambridge Road that examines community networks and measures resilience through a scientific and evidence-based approach. In trying to understand and evaluate social resilience, we have deployed scientifically rigorous theories and methods to examine the importance of social resilience across different urban contexts and demographic groups. One of our research collaborators for this project is Dr. Jonas Joerin, who will mention this in brief in his presentation later. And that brings me to introduce our three speakers, all of whom have worked across various government agencies and communities on a number of research projects. They will share their research and reflect on how they can be translated into actionable outcomes for building social resilience in cities and communities. Our first speaker is Dr. Jonas Joerin. Dr. Joerin is co-director of the Future Resilient Systems at the Singapore-ETH Center. His research interest is to better understand human environmental processes in the context of disasters, and he has done fieldwork in numerous places across the world. Dr. Joerin, the time is yours.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for the introduction. I would like to thank the organizers for having invited me to this session. Today, I will speak about measuring and building social resilience. Why do we need social resilience? We need social resilience because well-functioning social networks help societies to overcome disruptive events quickly and efficiently. For example, people can support each other to more quickly recover from a flood, or people have to use their coping capacities to adapt to new working conditions during a pandemic like COVID-19. Both examples illustrate that the kind of social resilience needed is very much context specific. The social resilience needed during a flood event is different compared to a pandemic. The term social resilience is increasingly used in the media as well as in politics. But what does it mean? Broadly speaking, social resilience is about social entities and their abilities to tolerate, absorb, cope with, and adjust to environmental and social threats of various kinds. This illustration here shows different attributes that are connected to defining social resilience and commonly used in research studies. The wide range of attributes, ranging from beliefs, volunteering and norms to equity, social capital, social networks, and so on, highlights that social resilience is multifaceted. Depending on the research focus, one may look specifically at social networks or social capital. In most studies, and depending on the context, a problem-specific set of attributes is used to measure social resilience. Depending on the perspective, social resilience refers to many different aspects. The coping capacities of individuals or households are different compared to communities or organizations. At the same time, the ability of individuals to cope and adapt to a threat depends on their ability to draw resources from their community. Also, boundary conditions set by institutions, nature, and technologies matter. For example, an individual will adapt more quickly to a pandemic like COVID-19 if he or she has a spacious apartment and a flexible employer who permits home office. Ideally, this individual is further supported by institutions that provide financial and other forms of support. Another example, organizations that have members who are capable to make a meaning out of emerging or existing disruptive events have higher situational awareness, which in return may support decision-making processes. The ability to make sense of a situation is critical in organizations that are closely operating with technological systems. For example, in control rooms focusing on traffic management, staff members not only need to have the skills to monitor continuously the flow of traffic, but must also be able to detect threats and communicate them to their colleagues. These examples highlight that social resilience is about the interconnections between individuals, family, friends, communities, organizations, and systems. At FRS, we approach social resilience from different perspectives. For analyzing the resilience of individuals and of networks of individuals, we use interviews, surveys, and lab experiments to identify their ability to manage, recover, and learn from disruptions. For analyzing the resilience of organizations, we use methods related to AI to predict disruptions from infrastructure and social media data, which reveal weak signals. We also use human-computer interaction methods, such as eye tracking, to detect cognitive states, mental workload, and fatigue among staff members working in control rooms. In a comparative representative study, we are currently using surveys to analyze the social resilience during the COVID-19 pandemic in Singapore and Switzerland. Based on the literature, we find very few studies that have analyzed social resilience during pandemics. Hence, there is a lack of knowledge what the key social resilience indicators or attributes are to explain how individuals cope, adapt, and learn from such an event, and how relevant networks are changing. While Singapore and Switzerland both have a multicultural population, they vary in how they approach the current pandemic. In Singapore, until recently, the goal was to have 0 cases of infections, whereas in Switzerland, the goal is to not overburden the healthcare system. Our initial results show that in both countries, the social cohesion during the pandemic is high, indicating a high willingness of people to help others. In contrast, unlike what we observe during natural disasters such as floods, social support and network interactions are less pronounced. This is presumably due to the social distancing measures imposed in both countries to control the spread of the COVID-19 virus. From these results, we find that during COVID-19, people have to rely strongly on their own abilities to manage the crisis. Collective actions and support play a limited role during the disaster, unless they can be carried out in virtual ways. We will monitor the social resilience attributes over time to understand how people gradually adapt to COVID-19. The increase of online and virtual interaction indicates that people and social networks are flexible to adjust to a pandemic. We will also explore how people change their habits, such as using e-commerce opportunities to shop instead of visiting a shop physically. The outcome of our study will help us to contribute to the identification of generalizable indicators for social resilience. A critical element in studies related to resilience is the ability how individuals, organizations, and systems contribute to building resilience. In another study, we conducted a field survey in the Cambridge Road area in Singapore to analyze whether individuals who attend community events, such as getting informed about climate change and tree planting, build more social resilience against future climate-related hazards. This project was directly supported by the Center for Liveable Cities and Participate in Design. It was also part of a larger multi-stakeholder project led by the Center for Liveable Cities on building community resilience by design. The results show that people who attended such events give a high importance to their community, trust more in the local leadership, and are overall more engaged in their community compared to non-attendees. The positive effects of such events on the social resilience of communities guides future efforts to better manage potential disasters, such as floods or threats from sea level rise that are becoming more prominent in Singapore. Understanding how to build social resilience is relevant. Hereby, the way of communicating important information to individuals, communities, authorities, and other stakeholders plays a decisive role. Hence, we have developed a social resilience analysis tool which provides user-centric and interactive dashboards to pull out and compare attributes or variables of interest. This tool allows to quickly visualize the results in form of data distributions. Our tool helps to identify critical attributes of social resilience and supports the planning of adequate and context-specific measures to enhance social resilience. In summary, I would like to highlight that social resilience is high in case of an adequate coupling of individuals, communities, organizations, technologies, and the natural environment. Social resilience is dynamic and context-specific. For example, the kind of social resilience needed to manage a flood is different from the resilience features needed in a pandemic like COVID-19. Depending on the type of disruptive event, collective action plays a bigger or smaller role. Social resilience is becoming increasingly more important due to more people living in high-density urban areas, resulting in greater exposure to risk and thus higher vulnerability to disruptive events. The emergence of new technologies changes the way how people interact with each other and how our environment and the technical systems respond to our changing behavior. Social resilience matters for shaping these dynamic processes in a fruitful way. Therefore, having a better understanding of social resilience is essential. I would like to thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Jonas, for the presentation. Our second speaker is Dr. Matthew Matthews. Dr. Matthew is head of the Social Lab, a Center for Social Indicator Research, and a Principal Research Fellow at the Institute of Policy Studies in the National University of Singapore. Today, Dr. Matthews' research covers social policy issues related to race, religion, immigrant integration, and aging. Dr. Matthews, over to you, please.
I'll be speaking here on methodological possibilities for understanding social trust and diverse cities. I'll briefly touch on the benefits of social trust, some theories on social trust, and some methodologies to better understand social trust in the population. First, let's see how we benefit from social trust. Essentially, it generates much needed social capital. That's really a complicated word just to say relations between different groups of people. When people trust one another, they can put their collective interests over individual ones and work together. Second, it contributes to economic prosperity. Of course, it reduces the transaction costs associated with contracts. You essentially trust the people you do business with. You're all right at extending a longer term payment system. You help each other in times of crisis because you trust. Third, it fosters the growth of civil society. Luhmann said that trust is a social lubricant that liberates and mobilizes human agency, releases creative, uninhibited, innovative, entrepreneurial activism towards other people. Essentially, when there is a growth in trust, you see growing civil society, greater voluntarism. And of course, most people don't really expect this, but social trust or increasing levels of social trust is also correlated with better health outcomes. In Singapore, we have found out that it's important to have social trust, especially as we deal with the pandemic. I'll share more about this when I look at some of the research that we have done recently. But even without the pandemic, the reality is that when you have got many population differences based on demographic features such as people of different ethnic backgrounds, religion, language proficiency, age groups, people of different abilities, socio-economic backgrounds, migrant status, a whole list of differences. You can expect that without strong levels of social trust between communities, it's going to be hard to navigate the diversity in society and the challenges that come with that. Scholars on social trust have tried to look at the big issue, whether with higher diversity, really what comes with it is lower social trust. I won't be able to go through all these theories in detail, but at least just point out to you that some theories argue that with higher diversity, you expect lower social trust. The conflict theory, for instance, notes that this happens because of differences in norms and languages and between groups, and because of that, there are, difficulties in being able to communicate, so lower trust. Or for the matter that when there is too much diversity, people hunker down and essentially isolate themselves. On the other hand, some theorists argue that if you manage this properly, possibly by giving people a superordinate or big identity for them to locate themselves in, actually high levels of diversity can actually promote can build social cohesion. People will be able to go beyond their parochial differences and begin through contact, appreciate one another and the similarities that they have. And perhaps if there is a constructed identity that's given to them, they might embrace that as well, so that they can get along with one another. Let me now proceed to look at some methodologies that we have to better understand population social trust. One, of course, we can use various kinds of quantitative methods. Some of those are large-scale social or cross-sectional surveys. This will be useful to be able to look at trust that the population has for different groups in society or in the city, whether it's people you know personally, which most people seem to trust, especially those in the family, and probably people you don't really trust, people you meet for the first time. When you do surveys over time, you get some kind of time series where you're able to look at whether there have been changes in large groups in terms of how they relate to another group. So in this slide, you, for instance, have how Singaporeans trust people of different racial backgrounds. Essentially, the finding is that over the years, we compared from 2013 to 2019, we see an increase in terms of people's ability to trust more than half of another group. Large-scale cross-country studies like the World Value Survey, which is done in over 80-90 countries, can be very helpful too. It can reveal trust levels in different societies, and this comparative perspective allows us to better understand whether there are institutional characteristics which may account for some of this. In some cases, we want to emulate what is practiced in some societies where there are higher trust levels, what are the programs, policies, what has allowed some of this to happen. Perhaps countries where there are substantial population diversity, but yet have good levels of trust. Also, by tracking participants, doing high-frequency surveys, we have a better idea about specific events which can affect how people view each other. For instance, we have a online panel, which we started during the COVID, with the start of the COVID season in Singapore. And we've been able to track people over every 2 weeks, and we've got a sense about how different events might cause changes in perceptions of other groups. All these statistical data from quantitative surveys allow us to build good models where we're able to understand how societal trust has a role to play, for instance, in well-being. In some way or another, it contributes to people being willing to, especially when you have societal trust, to believe in authorities and what the authorities are doing. This ultimately leads to better attitudes towards safety measures, which then protects all of us. We also begin to realize that when people have lower levels of trust, the more threatened they feel about the pandemic. And ultimately, that results in worse outcomes in terms of their well-being. I've mentioned a few quantitative methods, but certainly there are many qualitative methods which are equally important and very, very helpful to better understand social trust in the community. In-depth interviews are a great way by which we can understand trust, and we can clarify with how actors of society negotiate with others, especially when it comes to cultural practices which they may not be comfortable with. In Singapore, for instance, there's incense burning, and in some customary practices involve the burning of paper money. Some of these practices may inconvenience others. But as you see in this quote, people try to negotiate that in different ways, and they deal with that. So this participant, for instance, talks about the fact that she recognizes that this is part of someone's religion, and so then being respectful, but of course she finds ways to be able to ensure that her windows are closed so the ash does not affect her. We've also used online diaries to get information about how people react in daily life, and for them to journal and record their sentiments about how they deal with other people and different kind of stimuli of what they read and hear on social media, what they see around them. This can be especially rich in a day where people use social media widely, and they're happy to communicate their thoughts in this way. Third, we've got ethnographic methods, and these can be very helpful. These include intentional observations, sometimes even participation. For instance, in the lab, we've got ethnographers, a team who have been studying gig economy workers. They rode along with these workers, learned quite a bit about how these groups are interacting with them, being with them, journeying with them as they deliver food to different places. Many of these delivery workers are lower socio-economic status, and they have to navigate around the city. We look at the kind of trust relations they build with anonymous customers, the platform, other riders, vendors, and a host of actors. We learn how this trust is built, how this trust is lost, and how features in the city can make them feel included or excluded. I hope this gives you a brief, very quick overview of the importance of social trust in building resilient communities, and of course the methodologies to better understand social trust. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Matthews. Our third speaker is Associate Professor Vincent Chua from the Department of Sociology at the National University of Singapore. Professor Chua's areas of research include the study of social networks, education, race, and neighborhoods. He has published widely on works related to social networks and social capital. Prof. Chua, over to you, please.
Okay, thank you, everyone, and good morning. Let me start by laying out my argument, which is that when physical infrastructures fail, for example, data centers and cloud computing, transport systems, electricity, and so on, it is the softer social infrastructure that determines our fate. In other words, when the hard systems break down, it is the people themselves that come to the rescue. We can think of different examples. When the train breaks down, we pick up our phones, we call our family and friends and say, "Can you pick me up?" or when disaster strikes, it's people and voluntary groups that mobilize to provide shelter, food, and provisions. These good Samaritans, as it were, are very often strangers to us, helping out their fellow countrymen, strangers whom we would call weak ties. Now, I wish to put forth the idea that weak ties connect the whole of society, a boundary-spanning pattern where long chains broker ties between diverse groups is ultimately stronger and more adaptable than a pattern characterized by bunching, segregation, and division. Now, as human beings, we have a tendency to keep within our own silos and to mix only with those we are comfortable with. But weak ties have the potential to disrupt those silos. A resilient system, then, is one where weak ties span a range of subgroups to connect the whole of society. A resilient system is a people-constituted safety net of strong and weak ties that stretch throughout the whole of society. Now, the theoretical basis of my saying this is the network sociologist Mark Granovetter, who writes about the strength of weak ties. He says that weak ties are strong in two ways. The first, at the individual level, is that weak ties lead people to new opportunities, such as information about jobs and careers, and weak ties help with social mobility. But second, at the collective level, weak ties also connect subgroups and help generate social cohesion between them. Strong ties create cliques that lead to overall fragmentation, while weak ties form long bridges that connect those silos to form a social fabric that is loosely coupled, but at the same time cohesive. Now you can see these diagrams here to illustrate the point. We can see that different subgroups of strong ties are connected by long chains of weak ties. Poignantly then, weak ties facilitate network diversity and connect people from different parts of the social structure, different races, different ethnicities and religions, different genders, different ages, different nationalities, different class backgrounds, and so on. Which then has led me to ask, how much network diversity or how much social mixing is there here in Singapore? Now, in 2016, we did a national study that measured the social networks of a sample of 3,000 Singapore citizens and permanent residents, which gave us very rich information on 17,000 names. We were especially interested in network diversity, which is the extent to which respondents were naming people from different parts of the social structure. We then correlated these measures of network diversity with measures of national cohesion, such as national identity and trust towards other groups. Now, to elicit the network, we framed our questions in terms of a range of scenarios, right? So you can see the scenarios there. For example, with whom do you discuss important matters? From whom have you borrowed money? And who helps with running errands? So on and so forth. We then followed up with what we call name interpreters. And for each contact that is being named, we then ask, what is the person's gender? How is the person related to you? What is the age group? And how did you first meet? And so on. Now, the results tell us that, network diversities are correlated with national cohesion, right? So you can see the coefficients in green. They're all positive and significant. For example, racial and housing diversities are positively correlated with national identity, measured in terms of a sense of belonging to Singapore as well as national pride. And so you have it here that weak ties create a more cohesive society. And actually, the logic is quite intuitive. It is relationships that make a nation. Values such as multiculturalism, meritocracy, and tolerance may be able to rally people but it is only by connecting people from different parts of the social structure that national identity then becomes a lived reality. What then are the sources of this network diversity? We found that schools, workplaces, and voluntary associations that include sports and cultural associations are significant drivers of network diversity. They bring different kinds of people together, but we also found some interesting details beneath these broad patterns, and I just want to talk about two instances of this. Now, for example, amongst the young, those aged between 21 and 34 years, schools tend to constrain ethnic and educational network diversity. You can see here on the left that schooling decreases network diversity for the young relative to the older cohorts. I think this may be due to academic sorting and segregation of students by achievement levels. Fortunately, however, workplaces have the opposite effect, that of increasing network diversity, especially among the young. You can see the line here is going up for those between ages 21 to 34 years of age. Now, moving forward, we need more research into how different kinds of schools or different kinds of workplaces give rise to different kinds of social relationships. But one thing is for sure, there is a link between organizational life and social networks, and it is the social context that yields the social network. Now, as practitioners and policymakers, we need to realize the value of weak ties for social cohesion and thereby to promote social mixing between groups across social infrastructure and platforms. The composition of the social infrastructure would be critical. A diverse membership promotes social mixing. A homogeneous membership, on the other hand, consolidates social circles. Actually, it's all about opportunity. When opportunities are present, it increases the likelihood of a connection. The shape of the opportunity follows the shape of the organization, the people that comprise it, and the diversity within. Diverse memberships create diverse opportunities that result in a diverse network. To conclude, let me cycle back to where I started. And I've entitled my presentation Whole of Society. The concept whole of society captures the idea that whole systems are best connected by bridges as long transmission lines, without which society would be a sea of disconnected islands, so self-sufficient that it ultimately fails to be resilient from the viewpoint of society. Strong ties are comfortable to have, but they are exclusive. By contrast, weak ties or diverse ties, because of their ability to connect subgroups, are inclusive. In conclusion, then, I will end with this line, which is to say that weak ties convert us versus them to we and make for a stronger and more resilient society. Thank you.
Thank you very much to our three speakers for sharing their research on the topic. So we will now begin the panel discussion. I will first pose questions specific to each speaker, and then next I will proceed to pose selected questions that we have collated from you, our audiences, whom have written in when you registered for this session. So maybe let me start with Jonas, who started by sharing with us about social resilience. As you have highlighted, social resilience is dynamic and it varies across different contexts. And you show us the example of Singapore and Switzerland. So how do you go about accounting for these contextual differences in your social resilience analysis too, such that you're able to compare across different cities and neighborhoods, and not just in terms of their social demographic differences, but also the differences in terms of the physical and social infrastructure and assets available? Jonas?
Thank you, Elaine, for the question. The tool that we have developed highlights the key social resilience indicators for different hazards and contexts. At the moment, it contains data from Cambridge Road and national surveys in Singapore and Switzerland. In the future, one may consider adding additional data sets to allow comparing key social resilience indicators across different spatial scales, such as cities and neighborhoods. The current version of the tool focuses on social resilience, aspects of community resilience, and the inclusion of physical assets and social infrastructure could certainly be integrated. Possibly, the tool would have to be further evolved to consider such aspects.
Thank you very much, Jonas. That was a very good comprehensive answer. I'll next move on to our second speaker, Dr. Matthew Matthews. Matthew, you talk a lot about social trust, interestingly, and you talk also about the ethnographic observations you had that you have done. So I was just wondering, given our diverse social demographic mix in Singapore, research in this field of social trust would definitely not be complete if we do not include an understanding or a study of the new and transient segments of our population. So share with us, what are the challenges or new insights that you have garnered as a social scientist in the process of your interaction with this segment of our population to collate new information and data?
Elaine, I want to echo that it's very important for us increasingly when you look at the city, not just to look at those who are supposedly permanently there, but those who are transient, because they do comprise the city and we need to engage them and understand their sentiments. We do know that unlike local populations, it's a lot more difficult to get those in transient populations on surveys, for instance. Even if you have an administrative database and you know where people live in, people move, and transient populations, because of work demands, they might have a lot more movements and it may not be very easily recorded. So we have to get used to using sampling methods which may not be probabilistic. So we have to, of course, ensure we've got robust statistical techniques to be able to deal with the fact that we are getting these samples not from very robust methods, but rather sometimes it's snowballing, sometimes it's stratifying particular dormitories or places and trying to get insight from that. Another thing that I think is very important is that when we deal with transient groups, it's important to build some trust with them. So longer term engagement strategies, whether it's by universities, maybe working together with migrant worker organizations or immigrant associations, are necessary so that immigrants get comfortable, they recognize how engagement with these different academic institutions, trying to better understand their needs and how they live in the city, that will be beneficial for everyone's interests, theirs, and of course the broader community. Because when you deal with transient populations, like in the Singapore case, we do also know that there are differences in language. So language competency, and we're trying to break through and better understand how to be able to speak well. Or, I mean, sometimes you might use a language which might be you might use English, for instance, but different places, how English is used might be quite different. So, of course, developing capability in translation, being able to build trust, even if it has to have a translator along with it. And so, of course, we've been emphasizing a lot more in ethnographic type of research, where researchers come alongside, be part of the living environment of migrant workers or others who might be transient in Singapore, and begin to be able to better understand their lived everyday experiences. Hope that provides some clarity.
Thank you so much, Matthew. Yes, definitely. And I clearly agree with you. It is important, and we should, through our research, also start to understand what exactly are the challenges they face, so that together we can build a more cohesive population here in Singapore. And actually, that brings me to the point about cohesion and to Vincent next, because interestingly, Vincent says that there is strength in weak ties. That's an interesting proposition. And you also mentioned, Vincent, that there is a need for diverse membership in the various platforms we have for promoting social mixing or network diversities. And you show the case of schools and at the workplace. So in the context of the neighborhood, housing neighborhood, for instance, what more could be done to promote network diversity? And what do you think are the challenges, especially as the makeup of society becomes more diverse and the need for inclusivity becomes more important?
Thanks, Elaine. Very interesting question. Let me speak about Singapore. In the housing domain, what we are finding is that there's a lot of social mixing that occurs within the public housing sector. There's also a lot of social mixing that occurs within the private housing sector, but not much connection between the two of them, the two domains, in terms of people forming relationships and so on. So what we need, I would suggest, if you ask, what's required in neighborhoods for network diversity, I would say we need third-party brokers who can bring the two groups together, right? So citing the case of Singapore again, in Singapore, we have the notion of RCs, right? RCs would be resident committees, and these committees manage the daily ongoings of what occurs within public housing itself, while NCs, right, these would be neighborhood communities, manage the private housing sphere. Okay, the third party broker in this case would be the RNs, the residents networks, okay, that organize joint activities and events that bring both RCs and NCs together, say to work on a joint project and so on. So we need third party brokers to be able to connect two segments of the housing population.
Thank you so much, Vincent. That's a good point. Actually, at this point, I'd like to circle back to Matthew, who just spoke to us about the methods he used to engage the transient population, for instance. So, especially now in this current situation, Matthew, could you share with us what were the challenges you faced during this period? While COVID-19 has clearly seen many segments of our population adapt the way we live, work, and play to adjust to a new normal, but how have you adapted your research methods for data collection? What are some of the challenges and new findings that have emerged?
Thanks, Elaine. Yeah, from the standpoint of being part of a lab which does very routinely does population surveys, right at the start of the pandemic was quite an eye-opener for us because we realized that we had many potential respondents' households closing the door, being quite rude to our interviewers because they saw them as potential carriers of the virus. So, so we had to adapt methods very quickly. So we're increasingly finding pairing ways of using, for instance, Zoom interviews instead of just the traditional face-to-face interview, being able to use different kind of online platforms to be able to engage people in residential areas and housing areas. We've had to try to push towards more use of online diaries, and we found it very profitable because especially when people are they're not able to get out at home, but they are constantly engaged with social media, what they feel about their reactions to it. Sometimes a lot of people actually don't post what they see on social media out, and they don't add on to the threads, but they have reactions, they have views, and they chat it with us because they feel that we are researchers and we're interested in understanding how they feel, and so they send us information, and these online diaries are very, very helpful. We've decided that it's very important, and we've decided to build online panels, especially at the start of COVID, and we realized that it's important to use online methods at this point of time to better engage people. One thing that we have found as we keep tracking people throughout COVID is the fact that trust towards communities can change, events, what goes on, the current, broader things that happen, new mutants of the viruses. People do have, people's trust levels can change about communities. And sometimes when you've got fault lines in society, some of these events can further exacerbate them.
Thank you, Matthew. Well, actually, thanks for sharing with us the research methods that you have. And I think, yes, you mentioned about your online diaries, and that is a very good way to continue along that line, especially now with the COVID situation. But there still is a role, and hopefully when we come out of this COVID, we are able to start engaging continue to engage the subjects, the community again. And just want to pose the next question to Vincent and Jonas, because Vincent mentioned about how we need third-party brokers earlier in his answer and response. And also Jonas has experience working in the Cambridge project and directly engaging the community. So my question is, in mobilizing community participation is the first step towards building social resilience as part of the process. But sustaining these networks and scaling up these efforts could be a challenge. So in your opinion, what can be done to ensure the longevity and expansion of such efforts at the community level? So maybe we'll start with Jonas and then Vincent. So Jonas first.
Thank you, Elaine, for the question. I think to mobilize community participation and ownership, it is important to strengthen collectivistic values such as working for common good or stand together for our nation. This can be done in Singapore through newly emerging platforms which have a stronger online presence and offer virtual interactions such as Foodhood Singapore or Nextdoor. Next to online solutions, community centers and related community activities are crucial to support social networks, especially in countries with an aging population like in Singapore or as well in Switzerland.
Yes, and Vincent?
Yes, thanks, Elaine. I think we would agree that it's easy to start, not so easy to sustain, So I think that the question here is really how do we sustain these community initiatives, the initiatives coming up from the ground and so on. I think it helps to see that things are changing, that proposals are being taken on board, that they are not ignored, right? And that there is buy-in from stakeholders. Nothing would in fact be more demoralizing than to see that community initiatives are pressed down, undervalued or ignored. Okay, so I would say that partnerships are cherished, right? We should aim towards that, and we see the impact and the change coming out from these collaborations. Now, of course, one very important stakeholder would be the state, right? That the state welcomes these efforts, these initiatives, and wishes to partner these initiatives to bring things forward, right? So the people and the state work together, they co-design, they co-create, they co-write solutions. And what is the outcome of all of these things? Legitimacy both for the state as well as for the community, right? And in this way, society is all the more enriched by those collaborations.
Well, thank you so much, Vincent and Jonas. We are drawing to a close now, but before we go, I thought it was a great presentation on how you shared your thoughts as an extension of the presentation that you shared earlier. So as we come to a conclusion, if I could just end off, I would like to ask each one of you to offer a point of reflection. Now, how do you think the science of building social resilience will change our approach in preparing for the next major disruption? The pandemic is one, but we are also aware that there are going to be unanticipated shocks and stresses in the future. But each situation makes us stronger, and we will emerge stronger from it. But we will always have to be prepared for the next one. So how do you think our approaches have changed? So maybe I'll go by the order of our presentation. So I'll start with Jonas, then Matthews, and then Vincent. So Jonas, please.
Thank you, Elaine, for the question. I think social resilience is not a new concept, and actually it has already been reflected in UN frameworks such as the Hyogo Framework for Action until 2015, and it's also included in the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction 2015 to 2030. So there, in these frameworks, social resilience is regarded as critical to better manage disasters. And in the context of Singapore and its growing exposure to climate-related hazards, social resilience will be needed to better anticipate, respond, recover, and adapt to potential disasters. Hence, research on social resilience may be in the context of climate-related hazards, but may also focus on other threats, such as terrorism and impacts of cyber attacks. Furthermore, the understanding of social resilience may evolve due to the ongoing digitalization. For example, social capital may not anymore be solely built by physical interactions of individuals and groups, but may also be shaped by online and virtual interactions. So social resilience and its research will evolve over time, also in response to the COVID-19 pandemic.
Thank you, Jonas, for sharing with us what are some of the threats and also bringing up the point about the need for cyber resilience. Maybe we'll leave that for the next discussion when we next meet. So maybe we have Matthew next.
Well, social trust has to be cultivated even before the pandemic, and we've been able to borrow or live on some of the social trust, the goodwill that's already present in the city between different groups, and that has helped us immensely in the management of the pandemic. That's been the Singapore case. I think moving forward, I think there's constant need to continue to build social trust between communities, to be able to measure social trust using different instruments, especially those which are pandemic proof. So we constantly can be able to tell how people are trusting different groups and what needs to be done to ensure that this trust can continue. So I think that's important as we think about going out of the pandemic and looking at the futures of living with different pandemics that happen.
Oh, thank you, Matthew. You made a very good point there that yes, social trust takes time to build up. It doesn't just happen overnight. It's an investment of a commitment and communications from the various parties that come together. And yes, we should have ways to measure it so we know how we're doing, so that we're ready and probably stand a better chance of withstanding the next crisis. Yes. So to our last speaker, Vincent.
Thank you, Elaine. I would say don't underestimate the power of weak ties. Right? So weak ties are strong. It's a paradox, but it's true. Yeah. I think the pandemic has underscored in no uncertain terms the value of network diversity, right? And we see different sectors of society coming together to help one another. So let me just cite very quick examples. Schools have had to work with households to facilitate home-based learning, right? That's one. The government frames the laws, but the public has to cooperate to see the infection rates go down. Governments have had to help businesses with additional budgets, right? People help businesses by going local, for example. And among the public, supermarket hoarding would mean the person besides you gets less, so on and so forth. And going out without a mask, of course, would be risky not only to yourself, but to people and everyone else around you. So I think the pandemic has underscored for us the importance of a collective response, and for people to understand that their collective well-being is really in their private interest, right, to secure true responsible behavior. So to prepare for the next disruption, I would say to continue to build weak ties across all of society so that everyone is stronger for it. Think interconnectivity and not just intra-connectivity. Yeah, so I'll just end there.
Thank you very much. It's a very interesting conversation that we brought together here, starting with Jonas sharing with us on social resilience, what is it? And then Matthew sharing about how social trust is a strong component to build social resilience. And then we have Vincent coming in to tell us that, hey, don't underestimate the strength of weak ties. So I really thank you, three speakers today, for sharing with us your presentations and the wonderful conversation that we had. So now I'll just like to share that going forward, you have heard the speakers, and going forward in this post-COVID-19 world, cities will continue to face challenges, and especially to restart our socio-economic life and reopening safely. So a strong, resilient society, as you heard from our speakers, is one that will emerge stronger, and we should seek not just to survive, but to adapt and thrive. So our three speakers also highlighted the social science methodologies that are useful in dissecting the intricate components of social resilience, and that includes examining the networks of trust and social capital across the various groups and geographies. So these components are all crucial for communities to self-mobilize and to bring about collective action. And so we realize that the social and psychological resilience of our communities is needed to complement the physical infrastructure resilience of the city, so that we can address the pandemic or any future disruptions as a whole of society effort. So I'd like to thank our speakers again. And before we go, on behalf of both CLC and URA, co-organizers of this session, I would also like to take the opportunity to share some research areas on the topic of social resilience that we're working on to further strengthen the link between research and policy making. So you can see here on the slides, three broad areas that we're working on, and we welcome opportunities for collaboration. So as our speakers have pointed out, Activity notes are notes for fostering social mixing and social capital to help reinforce social resilience in the different spaces. And the planning and design of such spaces will have an impact on our resilience outcomes. And second, on a larger scale, we also like to examine how towns can be planned and designed to encourage such positive social outcomes. And lastly, we will like to consider how we may sharpen and deepen participatory practices and to continue to evaluate the impact of projects that adopt participatory planning to foster social resilience as the actual process itself. So please do reach out to us if any of these are of interest to you, so that we can further discuss and collaborate. So our contact details are also available on the screen. And we hope that you found this session insightful, and we thank you and the speakers for your time with us. Thank you so much. Thank you. On to Andy.
Coming up next week, we will be having a series of 3 exciting e-symposia webinars, which will be organized in partnership with the Singapore International Water Week. They will cover a range of topics, including sea level rise, integration of ABC design features to living environment, and also feature a pitching session by 6 promising startups. So you can register for these webinars via the QR code below. We are also happy to share that the Urban Sustainability R&D portal has been launched. Through the portal, you can view the lineup of upcoming webinars, read about our RIE 2025 plans, and also explore various innovation support opportunities. You can access the portal via the QR code below. Thank you very much.